All right, everybody, welcome back. Obviously, I've been having different voices coming in from different spaces, speaking to specific things, and so I'm excited to introduce Benji to you guys today. I'm excited to get to, unpack this whole conversation around racism in the evangelical church and how that's played out and all the things. I've followed Benji on Instagram for several months now, and I've just been very impressed with his work, his content, the things that he's saying, the nuance, the specificity. So I wanted to pull him on and have him get to share his perspective and insight and all that. So Benji, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
For sure. Well, so to get us started, just because I know, I bet a lot of people who are listening maybe have never heard of you before or been exposed to anything that you do. Do you want to just give them a brief intro of who you are and what you're doing in the world?
Yeah, so I'm Benji. I am a content creator. I kind of fell into that. But I am very much a content creator now. I'm a former educator. I spent 20 years in the evangelical space, both in Black and white spaces. And so I've been able to see it from both angles, both sides of the coin, if you will. I am a former music director on a few of those worship teams, so I got to see things from the worship angle as well. And what I do, if I can put a sort of a bow on it, because I kind of do a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But I talk about a lot of different things on my Instagram. Everything from racism to where it dovetails with church, politics. I talk a lot about my experiences as an adoptee as well. And then we do some fun things as well. I do a series on my Instagram called 90 Minutes I'm Never Getting Back, where I watch a movie that I know is terrible for the first time and just live Instagram through it.
Nice.
And sometimes there's echoes of evangelicalism there as well. I did one of the Left Behind films a few months ago, so that was a lot of fun. So yeah, a lot happens on my Instagram.
Nice. That's awesome. I've not seen one of those lives. That sounds like fun. That's hilarious. Okay, so when you say music director, does that mean you were worship leading? You were putting the worship teams together? What did that entail?
So being an MD on a worship team means that you're directing the band. So you're not so much picking people as much as you're kind of telling them where to be when. Okay. So sometimes if you've ever been in a church service and you see somebody who's a musician speaking into a mic, but you don't hear it, they're actually speaking in the headphones and the inner monitors of all the band members and the vocalists, letting them know, okay, the chorus is coming up, or we're transitioning to this song, it's in this key. Or sometimes if a musician is unclear about where they're supposed to be, I will give them the chords or the requisite melody or whatever that is.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very cool. So I saw, actually, this is really recent, but you posted something about a difference between adoptees who were adopted from birth versus adoptees who were adopted later in life and the kind of impact that it has on them.
Yeah.
Were you adopted from birth, or was that later, or what was that for you?
Oh, I was adopted at a month old.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I don't know, there's so many directions this conversation can go, but basically what I want to start with, Benji, is mostly just getting to hear from you and just hear your story. I know for a lot of people who are listening or watching, this is probably the first time they're being exposed to you. So we'd just love to get to hear your background, your story, whatever you feel is pertinent and want to share. I'm all ears, and I'll probably just interject with questions as we go.
Sure. Yeah. So grew up just outside of Philadelphia. Like I mentioned, I am an adoptee. I was taken in very early on in my life, probably about 6 or 7 weeks old. And so I grew up outside the city, had a real interest in music, and I grew up in an adoptive family that was very musical. So there was music around all the time, and there were instruments around. And then so that quickly became my passion in life. I picked up guitar at around 7 or 8 years old. And then from there on, just started playing in bands, did all that kind of stuff. Didn't have a really extensive church background initially, though. That didn't happen until I was about 12 or 13 years old. From then on, I started getting involved in church in different capacities, like boys mentoring, that kind of thing.
How did you end up getting involved in church to begin with?
So my adoptive parent was starting to get back into that element of their spirituality. And so they kind of pulled me and my younger brother along. And So it really wasn't so much of a choice, or like even accepting Christ wasn't necessarily on my terms.
Yeah.
It was her, or like, it was being presented with the idea several times and not really being sure what not. And then after a few months being like, no, you're going up there and you're getting, so, it really wasn't my faith, at least not initially. It was very much by proxy early on. And because it was a one parent household, I was put into boys mentoring because I had struggles. I had struggles with a lot of things, self-esteem, figuring out who I was, all things that are normal, that I understand now as an adult, that are normal for kids who are, adopted from birth. You're disconnected from sort of your host reference, if you will. So you struggle emotionally with who you are because you kind of don't know who you are practically if you don't have any reference for where you come from, So had a lot of those struggles early on. And I think that my adoptive parent thought that, being in a Christian environment, I might have some be able to get some kind of piece of that back. A lot of, I can't replace your father, but maybe Jesus can be your father, like that type of language, which isn't the healthiest language, to be honest, but didn't know that then, so yeah, I struggled a lot. And there were also issues within that family system as well. I think a lot of people adopt without really fully understanding the psychological ramifications of what that entails on both sides. So not only just what the adoptee is going through, but also if they haven't addressed the things within themselves that need addressing, if they haven't addressed the trauma that maybe they've experienced in their life, and maybe they're looking to the adoption to kind of fill some of those holes, they're going to be sorely disappointed. And so I think there was a lot of that tension growing up. As time went on, I became more involved on my own. But that really didn't happen until I got older, late teens, early 20s, started getting into college and things like that. Studied sound engineering in college. So I love being in studios. I love recording. I love doing that type of stuff. And it was an outlet from kind of the mess that was going on in my life, because like I mentioned, like it was rough, and it just got rougher as I got older. Things eventually kind of came to a head, and I ended up leaving that environment, and it was very turbulent for a while, but eventually I ended up on my own, moved to Florida, started teaching, became a fourth grade teacher with the Boys and Girls Club. And so I got into nonprofit and started getting into all kinds of different opportunities within that. That being said, a lot of those gremlins from my adoption started to creep in as I got older, in a very practical sense. So when I was born, my birth certificate and my social security card didn't have the same names on them. So one had my mother's last name and the other had my father's last name. Never met the dude, but his name's on my birth certificate, And that doesn't present a problem when you're younger, but when you're, 1,000 miles from home and you're looking to transition out of one job into another and get an apartment and do all kinds of stuff, when your documentation doesn't match, all of that stops. And I should mention that around this time, I was about to get married. So I ended up not being able to work for about 2 years and was homeless for a large period of that time. And, still serving, still going to church, still faithfully serving, being like an MD. I wrote in a post a few months ago, I didn't have my home, but my church always had a guitar player. They always knew they could rely on me no matter where I was, no matter how many buses it took to get to where I needed to get. I was always there. Eventually, we did climb out of that. I was able to get my documentation sorted out thanks to a local nonprofit that was doing that. And I ended up getting to work with that nonprofit in a more official capacity and serving the homeless. Served at a couple churches in Florida, but the last church I was at was really where I got to see the underbelly of white evangelicalism. Those churches that I went to in Florida, both of them were my first experiences with white evangelical spaces, because up until that point, I had been in largely Black spaces. And there is a very big difference between those two things, especially when it gets into denominations and things like that, Baptist, Kojic, things like that. But in white evangelical spaces, especially when it's more of a mega church style thing where you're serving at a campus of a much larger, entity, there's a lot of similarities. And so we did that. But the last church I went to was really where I started to see the racism show up in a real way. At the previous church, there hadn't really been a whole lot of stuff, maybe little comments that fly by you. I've shared this and other things before, but I remember being in a car with my former pastor's mother, who basically said that, so Barack Obama was the president at the time, and she had mentioned that she felt like Barack Obama didn't have the real Black experience because he went to Harvard, which is to essentially insinuate that, intelligence and Blackness are insimpatico.
Right.
And it's one of those things that just kind of flies by you in the sense of general conversation. And then you get home like afterwards, you're like, wait, what the heck was that supposed to mean? But when we went to the church after that, it started being really, a little more intense. A lot of anti-Obama sentiment that didn't really seem to make any sense. Literally having like being driven home from my first worship practice, and your worship leader is railing on about how much they don't like Black Lives Matter and how they don't think Black people actually have experienced real racism and they don't know what that means, and completely unprovoked. So yeah, I've seen a lot of that happen. And then like a lot of people, 2020 was really the flashpoint for me. It was where things really came to a head, and it wasn't so much Trump that was the thing that set me off. Like, Trump is who he's been for the last 35 years. Like I said in my stories recently, that he is the logical progression of a post-Reagan Republican Party. Like, he makes sense to me. It was my church's reaction to all of the shootings that were happening that year. So, Ahmaud Arbery and George and Breonna and just all of the names you remember. And there was no response. And it was that sort of set all of the wheels in motion. And I suppose we can go into details in a little bit later if you want to, but I ended up leaving church in 2020 and kind of being in this weird space of, I've always done the rinse and repeat of, I'm leaving a space, I'm going to try to find something else. But I was so just emotionally exhausted and just taxed by the end of that I just needed to stop. But I was still in this weird, like, in between emotional, spiritual purgatory, if you will, and didn't really know where to land. And suddenly, as if serendipitously, I landed on a bunch of pages on my sort of explore page on Instagram that started talking about this concept of deconstruction. And I hadn't considered that at all, but it was them really kind of putting a name to a face for me. And I began to pull on that thread and ask questions and dig into certain things, and started talking about it on Instagram, and eventually shared my story of leaving church and why I did it and all that stuff. And, so that was 3 years ago now, and it's kind of begun to grow into this weird kind of non-specific thing that I do in social media space. So
yeah. So, nice. Okay, cool. Great. I mean, I have so many questions that were coming up, but yeah, it's what's coming up for me just in response to that is, like, similarly, I didn't realize, I was so removed from the racist conversation until the summer of 2020, right? When George Floyd happened, and just there was so much like tension where I was in Redding, California when that was happening.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so
that explains a lot.
Yeah. So I literally remember, like, 7 days, I just stepped away from Instagram. I stopped putting content out and was like, I need to, like, pull back. I don't know what's going on here. I was getting, like, a lot of demands almost from people on two different sides of this conversation. I'm like, what are you talking about? And it was so intense. And so I just, like, put it away, and then just started, like, doing my own research as much as I could find. Like, I just wanted to listen, especially to Black people, on what they were saying about racism. And I started, like, just YouTube videos, podcast episodes, documentaries, right? And I think on, like, about day 7 of that process, I was watching, I forget the name of the documentary, but it was like, it was on Netflix, I think. And there were a lot of graphic images of lynchings or whatever, and just talking about, like, the prison system and, like, just some things that had happened, and some of the stuff I'd never heard in my life. And I was like, what? And about halfway through, something clicked, and emotionally, whatever was, like, protecting me broke, and I just started weeping. And I was like, I have not been a human in this. I didn't know that I wasn't listening. I couldn't hear it. I couldn't feel it. And like, that was a turning point for me. It was pretty dramatic and like isolated, but
Sure.
it forced me to have to like enter into that conversation in a different way, with a different posture, with the humility that I was threatened by before, and all of a sudden found like was leading. So when you're describing that, I'm like, oh my gosh, I remember that time in our country. And that, I think that was like really consequential for a lot of us, that summer was so anyway. So I would just love to hear first, when we just step into that space on the race side of this, like was there something that happened that made you finally decide to walk away from church, or was it like a culmination of things? Like, what ultimately led to that decision, I guess, is where I want to start.
So what led to that decision? Well, certainly there was a cumulative element to it where things had happened in the past. I mentioned some of those things to you, and some snide comments and things like that about Blackness, or standing behind two white people talking in a line about like why Black people are a certain way, when they could have very easily turned around and talked to us, and we would have addressed some of those things. But for me, what did it was, so I mentioned that our leadership team was not really talking about it. But if you'll remember, a lot of churches were talking about racial tension around that time, mainly because I don't think they could ignore it. So as you start seeing messages from Furtick and all of the major kind of people, and I think at one point Bethel did like a total Gandalf thing where they like were banging a stick on the ground, and like it was a whole thing. I've had a good laugh at that clip multiple times, but a lot of churches, and our church, the one that we were going to, was one church that was a part of a network of churches, with one main church based in the South. And so I think there's like 60 of them like worldwide, or something like that. And a lot of other churches in the movement were discussing this thing. And, like, so white pastors being like, hey, white people, we need to look at this. Like, racism is not the way of Jesus. And it was in the middle of a lot of the Black Squares thing that was happening.
Right.
And so we noticed that there was a palpable silence from our leadership team. And at this time, our church had about 250, 300 people in it. And my wife and I alone were about 20% of the Black community there. It was tiny. There were only a handful of us. But one of the other Black people who was there, who eventually also left and we're still really good friends with, they hit us up and were like, yo, like, do y'all find it strange that like our pastor isn't talking about this? And we were like, yeah, I mean, it's not entirely surprising given past actions, but they should be talking about this, especially considering other people in the movement are discussing this. So what's the holdup? But we said, you know what? We'll give them another Sunday's grace. If this coming Sunday, you don't say anything, then we're gonna be like, hey, what's going on? Sure enough, Sunday rolls around, not a peep. So we make a plan to talk to the worship director, because the worship director essentially functioned like an associate pastor. Like they were the right-hand man of the pastor. But before we could do that night, the pastor called us, called my wife on her phone, and they were like, hey, so we just heard about the George Floyd thing. Now, this news had been out for a while by this point, like at least a month by this point. Now, let me also say that this pastor prided themselves on not having a TV, not listening to like, the political this, that, or the third, but they moved in a way that is reflective of Fox News talking points, which was very interesting. So it's like, maybe you don't have a TV, but y'all have the internet,
Right.
So it's coming from somewhere. Either that or, Republican politics really haven't changed that much in 40 years, and they haven't. But so they were like, yeah, I literally just found out about this, so I didn't know, and blah blah blah. But ultimately, a whole lot of filler words later, they said, we're not going to address it. And their rationale was, in so many words, they said that if we address this, we'll have to address everything else. If we address the racism thing, then in their words, they'll have to address the gay thing. And we kind of just don't want to touch that. And people are going to expect us to do this and blah, blah, blah. It's a church of 300 people. I don't know who's going to expect them to do anything, but that was their thinking. They just didn't want to touch it. And they certainly had enough privilege to, exist above the fray of that. Because like I said, we were 20% of the Black population and none of them were on leadership.
Right.
At least, well, I won't say none of us were on leadership, but we weren't in the type of leadership that could affect change that way. And so that whole conversation enraged me. And so by the end of that, because I knew it was a cop-out, like, and here's what they said. They said, we want to release you to have like prayer nights about healing the nation and blah, blah, blah. It's a very nondescript way of like not dealing with the real issue. You just say that the country needs to heal and not, hey, white people recognize your privilege. So essentially you are tasking people of color with addressing their own oppression when they didn't ask to. And it's really, it's absurd. And so, but I saw through the tea leaves of that. I'm like, this is BS, didn't say that on the phone, of course, but the second we hung up, I was like, I'm done, because trust is broken now. Like, I can't trust you. Like, I already can't trust you because there's certain conversations I can't have with you. And no church that talks about their open door policy as much as this one does should have that be an issue. This should be a safe space, but it can't be, because when you're Black in a white evangelical space, holiness is essentially the degree to which you can divorce yourself from your Blackness. So you'll have somebody who's white be like, on the pulpit saying like, oh, I love being Polish, or I love being Italian, or I love being German. But the second I start having pride in my Blackness, it's like, hey, Ben, you're more Christian than you are Black. Never heard that said to a white person before. So,
and you've had that said to you?
Oh yeah, I've had it said a couple of times, like once in the mission field too, in Europe. When a person running a hostel was treating me and a Filipino person on that trip differently than the white men. Noticeably, like asking us to remove hats and then allowing white men to keep theirs on, saying men don't wear hats inside, saying men don't wear hats inside. Yeah. And then when I tried to deal with it, my leadership team, which was all white, most of them were silent, and the other ones were like, you're more Christian than Black. And I'm like, duly noted. That does not change the fact that I'm being treated differently. And that was kind of the end of the conversation. And so that's kind of where all of the things that had accrued kind of came to a point where I was like, it's right in front of your face now. And you are telling Black people, hey, I don't have your back.
Right.
You are my family in Christ, but to a point. And I think some of that is obviously white privilege, but some of that is also theological, where, there's a certain element of that theology that sort of forsakes the now for later. So it's like, we're so concerned with getting to heaven and storing our treasures up that we say, screw it when it comes to here. Who cares about racism here when we'll be, skipping down streets of gold tomorrow,
Right.
And so I was done. I was like, I've seen what I need to see. I don't feel safe anymore. I already kind of didn't trust the leadership, but I was, trying to be obedient and stay. And as an adoptee, there are a few things that scare me more than being alone and being isolated. So I'm like, I already have a really weird relationship to the concept of family. So if I walk away, I may never have it again, even if it's not good. So there was a lot of things swimming in my mind at the time, but I was like, I can't do this. So my wife had to be like, okay, look, I know they're on some BS right now. I get it. I don't agree with it either, but let's stick in. Let's try this. Let's try to do what we can with what we've got. And, we'll see what happens. And so it took some real convincing, because I was livid, but eventually I was like, you know what, fine. because I can't leave by myself. That's not fair to you. And, you know, I'll be darned if this, you know, messes with my marriage. I'm like, it's not going to happen. So, like, this ain't like we survive homelessness. This is not going to be the thing that takes us out.
Right.
So, I sat there for a while and I was like, okay, cool. 45 minutes later, we get a phone call from that friend I was telling y'all about. And they had just gotten yelled at by the pastor.
The person that was on the phone with you 45 minutes
Yes.
later? Okay.
Yes. And this pastor, mind you, my wife had told this pastor during this conversation that we had on the phone that we did not feel safe addressing these things. We did not feel safe having these conversations. Like, she put it real clear and across. When the pastor talked to our friend, they told our friend that we said that the space was safe to talk about it, essentially trying to gaslight them, because they were another person who was trying to say, hey, what's going on? Why are you not talking about this? Matter of fact, there were a few other people who tried to do that in a meeting that had happened at some other point in that evening. And they were accused of having the spirit of accusation, if memory serves, and were yelled at as well. I'm like, okay, so now you've told us that you won't back us up. And now you are lying to our friend, twisting our words in order to paint them into a corner to silence them. And I was like, yeah, you're not, you successfully talked me back into it last time. This is not, no, I'm done now. I'm done now. And my wife still
say about that part.
I think because my wife has been in church her whole life. So when initially it was hard, because they're so used to like being in church and serving and giving until you can't give anymore. But I think they were recognizing that like I couldn't give anymore, but they still needed a bit of convincing. And so they slept on it, had a real crazy dream, and then woke up and were like, hey, yeah, I got the confirmation I need. Let's get out of here, basically. And so, yeah, a few weeks later, we announced we were leaving, and it didn't detangle easily, we'll say. I think a lot of people who look at deconstructing people who have left are critical, because they say, you know, like, you should have left the right way, you know, but there is no right way. If you're talking in a lot of spaces, no matter how well you leave, no matter how much advance notice you leave, there's going to be some gossiping. There's going to be some, especially in that particular space, because anybody who leaves is considered bitter.
Right.
And the church always did everything right. So when we left, I got a bunch of messages from people. A bunch of people were like creeping on my Instagram, trying to figure out what was going on and all kinds of stuff. And I think after we left, like another 30 people would end up leaving, which is a sizable chunk. But I think other people were just kind of done too, and they had their eyes open to what was going on. And so, yeah, there was one thing that led to our leaving, but within that one thing, several things, both things that had kind of led up to that point and things that were happening very immediately at that time.
Well, it's part of the challenge is like when you leave, you have no control over the narrative, right? They get to tell everyone else who's still there what happened. They get to speak for both them and you. And so, you know, it's going to be very difficult to leave on good terms when you're the marginalized party that's like being pushed out or not protect, you know, like,
yeah.
And that's such a crazy making dynamic when you've been so integrated and these people have been doing life with you, and then you become the wanted person, or the, you know, the unwanted, I guess, or the criminal. Like, it's crazy. Sorry.
You
anyway.
become the person they warn people about.
Right.
Like the church
you warned about.
The church does a really, at least part of the church anyway, does a really good job of like making the outside world seem toxic. So it makes everything that isn't church seem like just ill-advised and weird and wrong and, you know, just evil or some flavor of demonic. And so to be on the outside of that, it was hurtful, because, you know, there's only but so much of the narrative that you can control. But at the same time, it was also kind of hilarious because of like the different stories you hear about why you left. And I don't remember what many of them are now, but there were like 2 or 3 narratives that were going out. And so whenever people would leave, they would talk to us because they saw us leave. And they were like, we left for a reason, but I don't believe whatever reason that they said that you're. So they would come over and they'd be like, hey, we just left and these were our experiences. And then every so often I'd be like, I'm just curious, what did it tell you about why we left? And it was never correct. It was never right. And it completely absolved the church of all responsibility every single time. And so that was always fun. And then especially the following year, when I wrote threads and put them on Instagram about why I left, it made clear what the narrative was. So I got to tell my own story on my own terms. So now it's like, whether or not you listen is on you. Now you're hearing it straight from my mouth. So whether my words as it pertains to my experience are louder than what somebody else is saying about my experience, now that's a you issue. It's not an issue of there being only one narrative. And I wouldn't find this out until later, but when the church found out that I did that, apparently they were like screenshotting my Instagram and like handing them out and talking about this thing in small groups.
Wow.
Yeah. Because when I put it out, it had a crazy reaction. Like, people who had left years earlier were like, yo, the stuff you're talking about now is a version of what I experienced way back when. And it's not necessarily always a racial thing, but just in terms of like theological issues and the way people were treated and just power dynamic stuff. And people who hadn't talked in a long time were like reconnecting in the comment section. And it was a healing moment for a lot of people. And it was really cool. But you could tell that there was a certain degree of threatened that the church felt about that. And then and you can't help but feel like a little bit of a badass when that happens, because it's like, okay, now I'm taking back control of my story, but now this got you shook a little bit. And that means that you think that somebody's going to listen to this. And I'm fully convinced that people did listen to it, but they're just too scared to leave. A lot of them, are college student age, because they really targeted college students. And when you're, 19, 20 years old and you're hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from home at school, and the closest thing to family are these people who love bomb you into infinity and tell you like you're great and you're wanted and you have purpose and all of these things, which by themselves are not bad things to say to somebody. But when it's done with manipulative and, sort of ulterior motives in mind, it can become a very dangerous thing. And so a lot of them, that's like family. And you cut that off, you cut off your support system. So I really believe there was a lot of people in the church who are taking things apart, but won't because they don't feel safe to.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you just have so much to lose. Totally.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of professional Christians who have a lot to lose, specifically their paychecks. So
right. Let alone your community, your reputation,
exactly.
All this. Yeah, that's so relatable. I mean, I left the church for very different reasons, but
Sure.
God, I mean, some of this is just too familiar. I'm like, oh God, I know exactly what you're talking about. So one of the things I love about the work you put out on like the stuff you write on Instagram, when you specifically address racism, is like you'll get into the details and the nuance and the the arguments that people, like typically white people, have used to defend themselves or like absolve, like you said, themselves of responsibility and like make it something else that's the problem, not racism or not them. What are some things that you would say to white people in the evangelical world that you're like, hey, these comments or these attitudes or rhetorics have like made you feel like this is irrelevant to you, but actually here's what's going on and here's some things that are still a problem? Like, do you have any thoughts you'd care to share in that respect?
So this presumes that the white evangelical would want to listen to me.
Right. That is a huge, yeah, totally.
You know, for as many differences as me and my adoptive parent had growing up and still have, I've been no contact with them for about 10 years now, but they did have some great pieces of advice for me, two of which were, if you're writing about a topic, assume that the person in front of you has no idea what they're talking about, which goes back to the specificity piece and nuance, because that all matters. But the second thing was pick your battles. And so I figured out after a while, whether or not a conversation is good faith or not. So, you can generally tell based on a person's demeanor, how they ask certain questions, their insistence on using the word woke out of context. And when it's white evangelicals, it's always out of context.
When they use that term, what do you think they're saying when they say that?
So whenever they use the term woke to say anything, they're talking about Black people. It is a shot at Black people every time, every single time. And here's why: because no other group of people use that word that way, because they can't, because there's a specific context. The word woke, and I did a couple of things on this. I think I mentioned I did something with Tim from New Evangelicals about it. And I made a post even before that about it. But the word woke was used to keep each other safe, because this was during the Jim Crow South, when, loitering could get you arrested. And Black people were being killed for made up reasons, because every piece of our existence was criminalized. And so if you know that you're unsafe, they would say, yo, like, stay woke out here. They're patrolling, or stay woke, this is happening or that's happening. And it's been a part of the zeitgeist for years and years and years, almost a century. And so it began to see, like, it's always existed amongst Black people. It's always been there, but it started to see a lot more attention in the last 10 years. And so, as is the case with white evangelicals and ostensibly the Republican Party, because, the Venn diagram there is very much a circle, they sort of grabbed that word as sort of a catch-all. And anything that contradicts their ideas of how the world should be is woke. At no point ever occurring to them that the opposite of being woke is asleep. And they're proud of that for some reason. But it's not really very surprising, because it's not an ideology that roots itself in, critical thinking or deductive reasoning. So of course they're not going to see it that way. But anytime you see the word woke thrown out there, it's a shot at Black people every single time. And it's kind of morphed into this thing that they use to throw at things they don't like. So when we had this bank bailout recently, you had a lot of guys saying it's these woke banks, because they insisted on diversity, equity, and inclusion that led to venture capitalists spending their money irresponsibly. But usually it would be like a board of 12 white people and one Black person and like one woman. Sometimes maybe it was 12 white guys and one Black woman. And it's like, well, it's their fault. Anytime anything goes wrong, it's your fault, because we lack the self-awareness to even begin to ask the important questions. But yeah, woke has become a dog whistle. Absolutely. And it makes Black people less safe, because now there's one more word we can't use because of how it's been weaponized. It's one more thing we can't, because there's very little of Black culture that is allowed to be just Black culture, in part because sort of the concept of whiteness has never meant anything it can't monetize. So it's so many parts of our culture have been distilled and turned into something else, or have been stripped away from their meaning. A lot of what people call Gen Z slang is really just AAVE, but you just hear it from white people. So woke is no exception to that. So anytime you hear that word used in a pejorative way, it is a racist term.
Wow. Okay, so I'm thinking about the white people listening right now or watching, who, I think probably have done their due diligence on deconstructing and like just becoming conscious of some systems they were part of or whatever, but maybe still, like, I'm wondering if they're maybe not conscious of the ways that some of this racism is still unobserved or like passively permitted. I'm just wondering if there's anything else you would want to share with like the white folk, maybe who are still in the church or who have come out of it, but haven't had to face any of the racial aspects of the problems that they've walked away from. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah. I would say that an important thing to talk about, like, I mean, you can read all the books, you can read the new Jim Crow, you can watch all the documentaries. I believe like the 13th is the one on Netflix.
Yes, that was that one. Yeah.
that talks about like the loophole in the 13th Amendment that enables slavery still. You can, you know, talk about all the laws that are still in place, or how the government still won't outlaw lynching even after it's been requested, you know, multiple times. You can do all that, but you have to understand the power dynamic at play. Because white people have been in power, you know, and honestly, there's going to be people who say, well, what about Obama? What about him? He's 1 out of 46. And even then, his entire first presidency was marked by a white guy named Mitch McConnell blocking his entire agenda. So even when he was in power, he wasn't. So power dynamics matter. Understanding privilege is so the best way of understanding privilege is, you know, basically privilege is thinking something isn't a problem because it isn't a problem to you. So you attach whiteness to that. So you're thinking racism isn't a problem because racism hasn't affected you. That doesn't mean you haven't had to work hard in this life. All of us have, but your skin color is not an impediment to that. You know, your skin color is not an impediment to your ability to get a home or just get loans from the bank or accrue wealth. I think I heard like the average white family has like well over $100,000 in wealth, whereas the average black family is about $17,000. And it might actually even be wider than that. So understand how your whiteness creates opportunities for you that they wouldn't necessarily create for me. And that's not your fault, right? Like, we're not saying being a white person is a bad thing. You couldn't choose that. That's not fair. What we're saying is that with that comes some responsibility. So for an example, as a cisgendered heterosexual man, even though I'm black and that creates certain hindrances, I'm still a cisgendered heterosexual man, and that affects like how I show up in the world. I have a responsibility to pay attention to certain things that don't affect me, that affect people around me. So the women in my life, the gay people in my life, the trans people in my life, be like a huge part of deconstruction was understanding how much harder it is for those communities. That understanding that even though I am a marginalized community, that does not absolve me of marginalizing other people. I still have power and I still have privilege that affords me certain advantages. And with that comes a responsibility to open the door for those people who don't have it in the way that I do. And so what I would challenge white people with who are maybe struggling this or wrestling with this, first of all, if you're wrestling, that's a good thing.
Right.
Because that means your heart is not hardened to the point where you just think like, oh, that's not me. That's a good place to be. Because that means some things can maybe start changing. But also understand that with your whiteness comes things that make the whole situation easy for you because it was set up for you. Especially if you're a white man. Now, if you're a white woman, there's some differences, but you also need to understand how you are being used within the greater framework of white supremacy, where there's moments where you can co-opt movements started by women of color because you are a woman, but because you're white, your voice will automatically be centered. Again, understanding power dynamics. Just because you're a woman does not necessarily mean that absolves you of responsibility in that way, right? So really understanding how you show up in the world, understanding what that means, you know, understanding that even if you are a white person even if you're a person who's maybe a person of color who's white passing, understanding that being white passing means that you have certain advantages. And I would encourage you to not try to lean into the marginalized side of yourself when you're being challenged in terms of whiteness, because you do benefit from that, even though you are a marginalized community. Like, you know what I'm saying? So like just being understanding of the nuances and the intersectionality there. And that's going to take some work, and it might be a bit exhausting, and not to make totally crazy comparisons, but I often say that I didn't know what fear was until I looked in my wife's eyes when I had to go anywhere after 8:30 at night. If that's not a reality for you, then how do you define exhaustion? Because my exhaustion and your exhaustion are likely two very, very different things. So consider that we live in two different nations on the same landmass,
Wow.
essentially.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a lot, but that's kind of what I would say.
Jeez. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Wow. That is wow. Yeah, see, I've never thought about that. That's see, like my privilege is showing, right? Like, man, that is crazy. Oh, okay. For the sake of time, I want to ask something about the adoptive side of this as
Yeah,
well.
absolutely.
Thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah.
Whew. I saw something on your Instagram. You said something about how an adoptee doesn't owe you a happy ending.
Yeah.
Would you mind speaking on that a little bit?
So there is a degree to which Disney consumption can be unhealthy for people because it gives them a false sense of reality. When we're in these situations, we talk about adoption in a very binary way, where it's like this baby was struggling, and now look at this family, they've come and taken them in, and now everything's great because they're in this space and everything's honky-dory, and they live happily ever after. It's very rarely that way, even in the best of situations. Particularly if you've been adopted as an infant, you are more likely to experience interfacing with mental health professionals. You are 4 times more likely to have thoughts of unaliving yourself, and maybe even attempts. I believe 4 times more likely than a person who hasn't been. So there's all of these things that happen when a child is taken from their birth parent. There's a disconnection there, and that disconnection can lead to things later on in life. A lot of ADHD diagnoses. I was diagnosed almost 25 years ago. So, there's that. And sometimes even other things, PTSD. I have never been diagnosed, but I'm fairly certain I have some flavor of that. All of these things. And you never really know, like, you can never really place the feeling until you get older and you start really digging in to these things. And especially for me, like, I kind of grew into the internet. I was born in the late 80s. So, YouTube wasn't a thing until I was in high school and almost the end of it. So, there's a degree to which, like, I didn't have those resources until I got older. And so when I got older and I started looking at this stuff, and I was like, oh, this all lines up. There's so much stuff that gets trapped up in you, and there's so many things you experience. But if you're in a situation where the people around you are not trauma informed and see things in a very black and white way, what you're experiencing that is the byproduct of all the things you went through before you could talk now gets treated as, oh, their grades are slipping. Well, they just don't want to work hard enough. They're just lazy. I don't think they want it. I think they should fail. These were all things that were said to me, by the way. Or they just don't want to apply yourself. That was my favorite one. Apply yourself. Everyone tells you to apply yourself, but they never tell you what that means. And it all comes back to effort, or it all comes back to just these, or if it's even paid attention to at all. But again, there's this narrative of salvation, essentially. Like, you were saved by this family, so now you owe them. So anything less than sunshine and rainbows is an affront to that.
To their benevolence.
Their kindness. And it's always this thing of like, well, don't you feel so lucky? Like, or you sometimes get guilt tripped. Like, you should be thankful because I put food on your table. And as I get older, I'm like, so was not feeding me on the table at some point? Like, shall I canonize you for doing the bare minimum? Like, is that what you want? Shall I throw you a parade down Broad Street? Like, what do you want? Like, and I think that's the stuff that gets missed, because it's supposed to be, you're thankful, and if you're not, you're ungrateful. Done. And it's always from people who have this removed experience with adoption, who only hear about it or only see about it in Lifetime movies and feel like it's A to B, but it's not that. No human experience is like that. The world is only black and white for people who can afford for it to be black and white. So everybody else is in the middle. Like, you've never met a person that wasn't in a gray area. So my particular gray area is this. It's, hey, there were advantages to me being adopted because my birth parent had struggles with substance abuse. And, it introduced me to music. It introduced me to a lot of things that I would not have been able to have access to. I probably got a better education because of it. And, I was exposed, again, just exposed to a lot more things. However, I still have a lot of resulting trauma from not only just the separation from parents, but also not knowing who I was, not being connected to my context, not seeing people who, shared my same tendencies or understood all those things. An adoptive family can get very close, but they can't nail it the way that a birth family can. So it's not this neat and tidy thing where it's all pluses. You know what I mean? And because people can't handle that, they expect you to acquiesce and tailor fit your reality to fit their comfort, by which point it's not your reality anymore. And so in order to justify and reify their scope of humanity, they have to deny you yours. And so that's why I said adoptees don't owe you a happy ending, because we're people. And a person gets to have real experiences. A person gets to feel a multitude of ways about one thing. The second that doesn't happen, that person's personhood is being taken away. And so I'm not going to allow you, like, I fought too hard to have a personality and to have my own sense of self for you to take it away because you don't know how to deal with discomfort. It took a long time and a lot of work to get here. Like, I'll be 35 this year. That's too old to me. It took me too long to get to this place.
Right. Totally.
Because of all the stuff that had to happen.
Yeah.
In addition to the fact that I wasn't told the entire truth about my adoption and didn't find that out until my mid-20s. That's a whole other ball of wax. So, like, I've had to work backwards my entire life. Like, I had to reverse engineer confidence. This took work. And I'm not going to just sacrifice that over a pithy comment from someone that refuses to decenter themselves. I'm not going to do it. And I know a lot of adoptees feel that way. And so when I put that out there, that was the thing. They were like, exactly, this is exactly how I feel. And it's not just younger people, it's people in their 20s, people in their 50s who are like, exactly. They expect me to be this thing and they took away my personhood, but not anymore. So yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah. Am I also hearing like you're not allowed to be upset or have challenges or acknowledge trauma without the person who adopted you taking it personally, and it's a commentary on them when actually your difficulty has nothing to do with them?
Exactly. It's like, unless you're singing their praises, you're crucifying them. And that only gets more tricky when you're in church, because, if you feel feelings that aren't happiness or joy or resplendence before the Lord, then something is wrong with you. It's a personal thing. And this isn't in every denomination, but certainly in evangelical spaces, it's this thing of like, you're not praying hard enough. It's a works-based thing. They tell you it isn't. It's like, it's not based on works, but it's based on works. It absolutely is. And so there's always this element of, you need to try harder, you need to pray more, or maybe you haven't surrendered that to the Lord, or this, that, or the third. When really you just have complicated feelings about something, and you're allowed to have complicated feelings about something, but it's not allowed in a lot of spaces because it requires an emotional vulnerability that it requires for me to exist, but doesn't require for you to get through your day. Like, I had to be self-aware all the time, and I'm thankful for it now. Like, because I was always a more sensitive cat anyway, and that helped, a lot. But when you can successfully detach yourself from that, of course you're going to be critical, because it threatens your defense. And no one around you cares enough to tell you that, hey, if somebody else's experiences in something that you will never experience threaten your reality, then maybe what you've built your stuff on ain't that strong. But yeah, there's very much the sentiment of you're not allowed to be this thing. You're not allowed to feel that thing. That is very much in play in that space. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Man,
Yeah. Totally.
yeah, it's wild. And I imagine people who are adoptees and maybe haven't had the journey you've had been able to connect to or identify this as much. I bet hearing you say that is probably like a breath of fresh air. It's like, oh my gosh, yes,
That's what it seems like. Yeah. And I was just speaking from my own personal experience. And I've talked to other, adoptees, in particular, other people who are transracial adoptees, and they have that's a whole other subset of stuff for them. And again, intersectionality, understanding privilege. Like there's certain things I will not experience because I was a Black person adopted by a Black person. But if you are a Black person adopted by white people, or if you are being adopted from a nation and say in South Asia and you're being adopted by white people, there's going to be a conflict, and it's going to mean different things in America because these different identities show up differently.
right.
So I feel a certain responsibility to amplify the voices of the transracial adoptees, because if anybody's going to get it badly, it's going to be them. Like I get it pretty badly, but a transracial adoptee, someone who's supposed to bow and sacrifice themselves at the altar of whiteness, dare speak against, the construct. Like we just saw what they did with Colin Kaepernick. They already don't like him as is because he made them confront uncomfortable realities. Now you're going to do it again in a different way. Of course there's going to be pushback, So yeah, it seems like what I'm saying is opening up some things for some people. And again, usually when I'm online, I'm sharing my heart and trying to be responsible about the way I share it and kind of attach different things societally to kind of, make it a little less pointed. And not that I put a ton of thought into it. It's just usually something I'm feeling that day or that morning, and or like the night before, and I'll type it and then adjust it as I need to. But so very often, a lot of things I post, I'll have come up with like 45 minutes before I post it. So it's these things I'm just kind of sharing, just kind of from the gut. And then I'll see all these reactions from all over the place. People from all over the country are like, hey, yeah, this is exactly it. This is the language I was looking for. And that's not even where my head was at, but it seems to be helping. So yeah. Can't be mad at
that. Totally. Wow. Thank you. Jeez. Yeah, there's like a scalpel, like a laser point type communication in what you're expressing and your ability to articulate these things and the different spaces that you occupy and the intersectionality that's taking place in your life. It's like, yeah, your voice is a gift. I'm really thankful for you doing the work of putting words to this. And I feel like I find it mostly inspiring and educational and informative. I'm like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. I didn't think about it that way. I'm like very much benefiting from what you're confronting and the way you're clarifying it. It's so helpful and needed. So yeah, thank you for doing what you're doing. I want to ask as well, like, how do people plug into what you're doing? What do you have to offer? What can people like engage with in your world? Like, tell us all the things.
Okay. So I'm on most social media. So you can find me on Instagram at heytherebenji. That's like kind of the front door, if you will. I do other things as well. I do a podcast called Important Things with Ben and Carol being my wife. We have a public one and we have a Patreon one. So patreon.com/important_things. There's a whole thing on my page if you want to like support what I'm doing monetarily, which has been a huge help recently. I'm just coming out of long COVID. And I had to essentially forfeit my job because of being sick. So that's been a huge piece of something that I'm pushing. But yeah, I'm on Instagram at heytherebenji. I am on TikTok at heytherebenji. I am on Twitter at _heytherebenji. And I'm currently working on more things to put out, more topics, and like things that are like reels and videos and things like that. So I've been looking into something on the moral majority, because that's a really important topic, but also welfare, believe it or not, and how that dovetails with racism and how that's been used and weaponized against people of color, for the last 40 some odd years. Working on a reel on that one, just trying to kind of get it down to a bite-sized, piece of information. But yeah, the wheels are always spinning over here. So
nice. Love it. Okay, great. Well, we'll provide the links below in the show notes so everyone can grab those. Benji, thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts, opening your heart, like sharing your story. Like, I'm honored to get to hear it. And I love that people get to hear from you here. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's fun.
Of course. Yeah, for sure. And everyone else, thanks for watching, for listening. We'll see you next time.